Alright guys, this is easily by far going to be the most important video I've ever made on the channel, and I know that's a very cliche thing for YouTubers to say, to get more likes, to get more views, to get more subscriptions, to get their video out there, but unfortunately YouTube is most likely going to demonetize this video because of the contents within it, which means the video will ultimately get suppressed. But of course, likes and shares do help the video out, and even if I can get 500 people to watch and listen, this is a W for me, right? I'm not a big YouTuber. I am by no means trying to get 1 million views on this video, but let's just jump into it, man. This is easily one of the most nefarious acts I've ever seen of social media censorship. I think this even surpasses the Twitter ban on Donald Trump, our former president, okay? This act has actually caused Joe Rogan to move to a alternative social media platform called Gettr. I'll leave the link to his Gettr account as well as the podcast episode that caused all of this controversy in the description below, all right? What you also need to know is that Dr. Robert Malone was the visitor on this podcast episode. It was about a 3-hour episode, and he is a very well-known doctor in the community, okay? He's actually done multiple clinical trials on various types of medicine. He has made multiple books. He's graduated from Northwestern University for his doctorate degree. He is also most well known for creating the mRNA technology. Now, this technology is prevalent in the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which, according to their respective companies, have a higher efficacy rate than the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which uses a more traditional form of vaccine technology, okay? Now, with all that out of the way, Dr. Robert Malone has actually been banned on Twitter a couple of days ago. He's no longer on Twitter because of this ban, and he decided to go on Joe Rogan's podcast to discuss what he was trying to say through his social media platforms. And this is, I guess we can call it, a very ironic thing that happened because social media decided to suppress him, the inventor of the mRNA technology, and now it is basically blown out into like a wildfire. Everyone knows who Dr. Robert Malone is because of this specific instance and because he was able to get on the Joe Rogan podcast, all right? Again, I'll leave the link to the Spotify episode in the description, but funny enough, if you decide to Google Joe Rogan, Dr. M, you don't even get Dr. Malone. You get all these other types of doctors. It seems like Google, YouTube, and Twitter are trying to suppress Dr. Robert Malone's message for people that are thinking about or advocating for the vaccines that include mRNA technology. Now, I'm not going to go through everything in the Spotify episode. It's about a 3-hour episode, but someone on Twitter named Jonathan_Witt has actually created a Cliff Note version, a too long, didn't read version of the podcast, and I wanted to go through a couple of very important points that were made on the podcast, all right? So the first point is that over the years, Dr. Robert Malone says he's coordinated trials which have received billions of dollars in government funding, claims he has worked with and knows many people at the CDC. He knew Anthony Fauci and has many friends in the U.S. intelligence community, now a quote-unquote pariah. Rogan brings up the Twitter ban. Malone says he's probably the only person with his background without a conflict of interest, says he earns no money from this unlike others. Malone also mentions his deplatforming from LinkedIn for pointing out that the head of Reuters is also on the board of Pfizer. According to Malone, LinkedIn subsequently reinstated him and formally apologized for the ban. He surmises why exactly he was banned from Twitter, COVID Care Alliance videos re-COVID vaccines, and or post about the World Economic Forum and their media management. Not completely understood or known at this time, which was the offending tweet. Malone discusses getting COVID in February 2020 and describes his lungs burning, says he took famotidine, I don't know how to say that, describes a trial that he has helped design using, again, the word that I can't say, and psilocybin to treat SARS-CoV-2. Further says FDA would not allow an ivermectin arm in the study despite the data. For some background, ivermectin has actually been known to be very effective against COVID as a treatment for somebody that does have it. Rogan wants to know why there is obstruction of these drugs, such as hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. Malone describes the involvement of Wright Brick and Janet Woodcock in preventing the use of these drugs in the treatment of COVID. He won't speculate on why, but says they're wrong. Malone says it is bizarre that Merck would come out against ivermectin. He says billions of doses of both hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin have been safely administered, as well as both being on the WHO's essential drug list. WHO is the World Health Organization. Malone says he got the Chinese protocols in February 2020, and these included hydroxychloroquine, says he gave the information to the US government. Rogan mentions the apparent success of ivermectin and asks what happened to Uttar Pradesh, high use of ivermectin and low deaths. Malone says he had long COVID, in quotes, and then also took the Moderna vaccine because at the time it was thought that it may help with this issue. Claims he had some adverse reactions to the vaccine, but despite these was ultimately fine. So on top of this, I do want to just quickly say that I did listen to the podcast, and he did say he didn't receive a lot of adverse reactions on the first dose, but the second dose of the Moderna vaccine actually caused the majority of his adverse reactions. The discussion briefly turns to natural immunity. Rogan mentions studies showing better effect of natural immunity versus these vaccines. Malone agrees. Malone discusses the Trusted News initiative led by the BBC and their charge against misinformation/disinformation and the use of the term anti-vaxxer to suppress anything against approved sources, according to Fauci and Tedros. Discussion turns to cancel culture in the medical field. Previous example with Fauci versus Duisberg and new leaked emails between Fauci/Collins aiming to ridicule the Great Barrington Declaration founders. Malone talks about Israel with high Pfizer vaccine uptake up to dose 4 and surrounding Palestinian territories with relatively low uptake without this discrepancy being reflected in death numbers. Says all-cause mortality is the most reliable variable. Malone says VAERS is unreliable and it's the best we got. Says there are issues both ways, death post-vaccine not necessarily vaccine-caused, vaccine-correlated. However, we've had this system for decades so we can look at trends and use aggregate value and large sample size. Rogan asks about the financial incentive related to the COVID deaths in hospitals. Malone admits he doesn't know the exact number, but says around $3,000 given to the hospitals if someone is diagnosed with COVID, further payments for ventilation and death due to COVID. They discuss the possibility that someone with a gunshot wound or trauma who happens to test positive for COVID and then dies may be labeled as a COVID death. Malone says the FDA has not done their job, mentions data manipulation and the case of Maddie DeGarry, which was allegedly reported as gastric distress by Pfizer in their trial, when it is claimed she had a seizure and is now wheelchair bound. Malone says there are all kinds of ways to craft clinical trials and study reports to hide the bad stuff and highlight the good stuff. Says what gets reported is often biased by expected outcomes and tricks of data, financial incentives to make bad stuff go away. Malone says Thomson Reuters is the fact checker of choice to Twitter and they are tied to Pfizer. This, in part, decides what is allowed to be discussed on Twitter. They discuss the attacks on the physicians, highlight cases of Peter McCullough and Kirk Malone. Malone talks about the attack against him to have his license removed based on tweets, and the Atlantic article written about him claims he killed millions. Rogan brings them back to the statistics around vaccine related to myocarditis. Malone says data shows incidences of 1 in 2,700 of myocarditis in boys post-vaccination. Claims that this myocarditis is different, but he says no data. Also, other adverse effects such as dysmenorrhea. I'm not even going to try to repronounce that. Malone discusses concerns around fertility post-vaccination because of what he says are lipids, lipid nanoparticles, with the potential to affect the ovaries in females. also talks about the spike protein and its ability to cause blood clots regardless of whether from virus or vaccine. Extensive discussion about the effects on the ACEII receptors and disruption of the blood-brain barrier by the spike protein. Rogan asks if the spike from the vaccine is different from the spike of the virus. Malone says yes, but we don't know if the difference actually matters. Malone says it's the job of the drug companies to prove that their spike, i.e. vaccine-created spike, is non-toxic. Rogan asks why so many people take the vaccine and have no adverse effects at all. Malone explains it with a response curve due to the phenotypic / genetic differences. He goes on to mention evidence that people who are not diabetic or have high blood sugar levels seem to be more greatly affected by these spike side effects. This may be part of the explanation for many people being able to shrug off spike adverse effects, but not others. Malone talks about the T cells, says we really don't know for sure what these vaccines are doing to our T cells, mentions cancer risks, but cautions against lack of data. Also discusses some evidence for increased risk of illness post-vaccination for a period of time. Rogan asks about the vaccine efficacy window. Malone says it seems to be ever shrinking and goes on to mention that in some studies, cites Denmark study, there is a negative efficacy, higher risk of being infected shown with increasing doses. Says this is specific to Omicron. Malone says we're administering a mismatched vaccine and driving the B and T memory cells toward a virus which no longer exists. Says his hypothesis for the poor viability of the vaccines on the basis is called original antigenetic sin. Malone talks about the high pathogenicity and low pathogenicity H1N1 to describe in part the differences between the COVID variant and Omicron. Further discusses the very high R number, the number of people infected by one person with a pathogen, of Omicron. Now, this, all in all, you guys just, probably listened to me ramble for about 8 to 9 minutes, but basically, this person has no conflict of interest. He is not making money off of the technology, okay? He basically, is having, Pfizer and Moderna use it, but he's not making any money, supposedly, allegedly, off of this technology. He also did not, seem very biased, because even when he calls out like myocarditis, which is a very prevalent, according to the data, a very prevalent adverse reaction in young males who take the Moderna vaccine, he says, this is, I guess, limited study with a limited sample size. He does mention 1 in 2,700. He also mentions, this may be affecting our T cells, again, being non-biased by saying we don't have enough data to support it, but the mRNA technology can reduce the amount of T cells or hinder our T cells, which is, inadvertently in statistical data, in line with cancer, essentially. So this man really went, above and beyond trying to be non-biased, unbiased. He did say that there are a lot of, conflicts of interest between the politicians, between Moderna and Pfizer. They could skew data to make it look like, their efficacy is higher when in reality it is not. I mean, if you think about this from a grand perspective, you can comment down below if you have somebody that that has gotten vaccinated with 2 doses or even more and still gets COVID. I would love to see those comments down below, maybe some stories that you're willing to share, right? All in all, there is definitely some type of monetary incentive for both Pfizer and Moderna. They've made billions upon billions of dollars this past year alone from this vaccine, and this vaccine is actually, I believe, a majority of their sales, which is kind of a pretty obvious point, okay? At the end of it all, this has been suppressed all over Twitter, all over YouTube. If you look on Joe Rogan's podcast right now on YouTube, he has no videos on this. I'm not sure if they were taken down, demonetized, if his channel got struck, but he typically uploads videos of the highlights within 2 days, and at this point it's been out for about 48 hours, so pretty surprised there. And on top of this, if you decide to go onto Twitter, a lot of things are getting flagged for COVID misinformation, even when, somebody is quoting a doctor word for word to come out with a tweet in Dr. Robert Malone. I also found it interesting when I tried to search up Joe Rogan, and I probably already mentioned this, but I was searching up Joe Rogan, Dr. M, and did not see the Dr. Malone autofill on the YouTube search bar. You actually have to type it all the way in to get something to come out. And yeah, even if you go on Twitter to the explore page and you go for like COVID-19 or you go for just trending in general, you're not going to see anything about Dr. Robert Malone. And this is pretty crazy when you think about it, okay? I mean, even when you go to news, it's not there. You go to for you, maybe you're really in the weeds with stuff, it's still not going to be there. They have effectively tried to suppress Dr. Malone's, I guess we'll just call it 3-hour episode with Joe Rogan. And this, again, has caused Joe Rogan to move to Gettr at this point in time. And that's pretty crazy when you think about it. He's actually moving to another social media platform to continue to get his message across. And this is huge for Gettr when you think about it, right? Like, if you have like celebrities on your social media platform, you're inherently going to grow because at least a fraction of the followers of Joe Rogan are now going to move to Gettr. And again, Joe Rogan, he's been one of the guys that has, had people that are pro-vaccine, some people that are hesitant for the vaccine, which, social media and mainstream media people are trying to call vaccine hesitant people, which is ridiculous. They're just hesitant to take the vaccine. And I think vaccine hesitant people is like categorizing people in the same boat of anti-vaxxers. At the end of the day, this is one of the vaccines that has gotten the least amount of clinical data before being released to the public. And at the end of the day, I wouldn't be surprised if so-called politicians have stock options and have stock in such companies that create vaccines like this. And there could be an inherent push. We've seen it already through the thread, right? Reuters and Twitter, Reuters and LinkedIn, Reuters and Pfizer. There's clearly some type of conflict of interest with various companies and various politicians. And I hope this video will open your eye to actually, look into the data, look into certain things, listen to some doctors that have an opposing viewpoint, because at the end of the day, you can be biased and not even realize it. And I think the best approach that most people should look to do, even though I doubt this is going to be a thing, but you should look for people that support your points and look for people that are against your points and hear both of them out. Because if you just hear one side of the spectrum, you're going to be, tunnel vision. You're just going to be, looking in your own lane and not looking, to different sides of the spectrum to really get a more balanced viewpoint. So this is where we're at right now. I think this is huge for Gettr. I think it's huge for Joe Rogan to be doing this. And Spotify, I would doubt, would actually ban Joe Rogan or like suppress or like do anything to his podcast, right? Like, they paid $100 million for him. So they're going to continue to keep him on, Spotify. Plus, Spotify probably doesn't have, as much interaction if they were to get rid of Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is easily the biggest podcast on Spotify, and he's the biggest podcast on the planet, right? So they're not going to do anything to him. Again, hope you all did enjoy this video. Drop a like, subscribe, comment down below if you have any thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video. I'm Cryptix, gonna probably re-listen to this podcast, and signing off.